Hello and welcome to the YouTube studio at the Munich Security Conference. I'm Jack Kelly from TLDR News, and I'm joined today by leader Mitch McConnell. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
We've got a couple of main issues we want to discuss, some of the biggest issues of the day, including Ukraine and the issues in China. I'd like to start with Ukraine, if that's okay.
Sure.
Awesome. So, US military support for Ukraine has so far mostly been through Presidential Drawdown Authority, as well as some foreign military sales. Do you think it's time for Congress to take power over the executive branch on this issue and be more active when it comes to how arms transfers are conducted, especially given how protracted these kinds of conflicts can often become?
Well, I don't think Congress ought to select weapons, but I do think Congress should and has been pushing the administration to make decisions in a more timely fashion. I think the administration has been too tentative with decisions to transfer weapon systems. Our European allies have had a tendency to do the same. The war is ongoing. We anticipate a major action by the Russians here in the next coming months. Time is of the essence.
And considering the kind of long-term nature of the conflict, do you think there's a role for Congress to codify these arrangements in a more binding way to ensure that future administrations aren't able to abruptly stop the flow of weapons?
Well, I think the biggest problem we're all running into now is we're running out of ammunition. I think the defense production capacity has been strained, both in the U.S. and in Europe, because of the intensity of the war. The amount of artillery shells being used on a virtually daily basis is straining the defense production all throughout the alliance. So we've learned some important lessons here. Vladimir Putin has not only attacked Ukraine, but he's awakened all the rest of us. And we need to remember what NATO is about. It's a military alliance. And we need to be doing this better. Time is not on our side here.
Absolutely. And speaking of weapons productions, just last month, the US announced that they'd be sending 31 M1 Abrams to Ukraine, due for deliveries in the latter half of this year. Since then, Ukraine has asked for more advanced weaponry, including F-16 fighter jets and longer-range ATA-MCS missiles. Do you support the US sending these kind of weapons to Ukraine, both when it comes to more jets and also more long-range missiles?
I do, and I think it ought to be done sooner rather than later. The same problem we've just been discussing here, the tendency to kind of sit on decisions until things get worse, and then you finally do the right thing, is not going to sustain this situation forever.
And when it comes to decision-making, both political parties have growing factions within them that are increasingly skeptical of how much money is being spent sending weapons to Ukraine. Are you worried that your fellow legislators might end up derailing spending in the future?
I'm not, because if you look at the amount of money we've spent so far, it's about 0.02% of our gross domestic product. And if you remind people of how much it would cost if Russia actually won, looking down the road, we're not spending too much, and we're not fighting the war ourselves. We're giving assistance to those who are fighting for their independence and for their democracy, entirely consistent with the mission of NATO. And I think that a lot of good for NATO has come out of this invasion. You've got 2 new countries coming in, Sweden and Finland. You've got a growing awareness in Asia. Prime Minister of Japan recently said, if you want to send a message to President Xi, beat Putin in Ukraine. So I think the democratic world has been awakened, and it's clear who the threat is coming from: Russia, China, Iran.
And when it comes to government spending in the US, obviously the debt ceiling debate is really starting to heat up, especially following the State of the Union earlier this week. Are you worried at all about the prolonged fight over the debt ceiling and the impact that could end up having on American readiness and their ability to supply arms to partners in times of need?
I'm not. We won't default. We never have, and we never will. There'll probably be some drama in connection with raising the debt ceiling. I've been through a few of those dramatic situations myself. The current president and I negotiated in the context of a debt ceiling, the Budget Control Act back in 2011. So we've been here before. What I think the American people and the rest of the world need to know for sure is that America's not going to default.
Final kind of topic on Ukraine. Some journalists and some politicians, including Republican Senator J.D. Vance, have entertained the notion that Biden and other senior figures in the administration were responsible for the attack on Nord Stream last year. Presumably, you don't agree with that analysis, but who do you think the most likely culprit was for that?
I have no idea, but I'm sure it wasn't us. Look, there are a few isolationist voices in Congress, in both parties.
Yeah.
But I think to sum it up, you've got the Speaker of the House, the Republican leader of the Senate, the leaders of all the national security committees, all of us supporting this war. There are a few isolationists in each party, and I think Europe should understand fully, and one of the reasons I'm at this Munich Defense Conference is to make it clear that the overwhelming majority of Republicans are not only behind the Ukrainians, but would actually do things more quickly than the president has.
Sure. Quickly moving on to the issue of China that you mentioned earlier. Just last summer, President Biden signed into law the Chips and Sciences Act, a law aimed at bringing semiconductor manufacturing to the US and reducing reliance on China. You voted in favor of the bill, and since then, a number of companies have announced that they're moving chips factories back to the US. President Biden has since then imposed export controls prohibiting US companies from exporting to China the technology, software, and equipment used in producing advanced computing chips and supercomputers. Do you support those measures too? Would you go further? And what are your thoughts in this area?
Well, you have to look at China two ways. On the national security side, I think they're clearly a threat. Clearly and unambiguously a threat. And on the trade and commercial side, we have a lot of interlocking relationships, very complicated, and trying to figure out the best way forward without becoming completely an island in international trade is complicated. So we know China's a threat. We know they steal our secrets. We know they try to find any way they can to observe and penetrate. But it is more complicated on the trade and commercial side to try to figure out how to sort out the relationship. Clearly, China has chosen to be an adversary. This wasn't our idea. I mean, we thought we were going to have a pretty good relationship. President Xi particularly has chosen a different path. He's chosen to be an adversary, and so we'll have to stand up for ourselves.
And finally, in December, the Biden administration rejected a ruling by the WTO that American steel tariffs violated WTO rules, arguing that the WTO has no authority to review what the US considers an issue of national security. Do you support the Biden administration's position on this issue? And if so, do you think that the WTO has become redundant?
I'm not sure I have an observation to make about that.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for your time, Leader McConnell. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Okay, good.